Award for the Best Biography and Book Trailer for her first book, Adventures Against Their Will. At the heart of her book series, including My Dear Boy, is a collection of World War II letters, documents, and objects that serve as witnesses to history. The treasure trove known as the Holzer Collection was preserved by her father, Oswald Holzer, Dr. Oswald Holzer, and tells a refugee story with powerful relevance for today. Classrooms across America and Europe feature lesson plans that accompany Schirm's books. Public exhibitions have highlighted Holzer collection objects in Orlando, Frankfurt, and Prague. And that's a true commendation of who you are, Joanie. So I want to thank you. And before I asked Joanie a few questions because we want this to be a casual book talk so everyone can just relax, because I really want to start thinking about what this book meant to Joanie, but also how and how these stories got lost along the way. So if Arlen could show, we're going to show you a little clip on Joanie, and then we'll begin our session.
Secrets revealed an international network of young people fleeing Nazi persecution and became a respected scholar, teacher, and author.
I had no idea. This is really an unexpected, uncommon journey that I have adored from the very beginning.
It all began after her parents passed away within 2 days of one another. While going through her father's belongings, Joanie discovered nearly 400 letters written in Czech. The first letter she had translated changed her life. It was written to her father by her grandfather just days before he and Joanie's grandmother were taken to a Nazi extermination camp. It begins, My Dear Boy.
April 21st, 1942. My dear boy, today we are leaving for a gathering point to follow the fate of those unfortunate people in 3 to 4 days who since last October have been gradually chased out of their homes and sent to concentration camps, robbed of everything they had. I am not certain whether I will see you ever again, so I decided to write these lines as my goodbye to you. I just always try and imagine him sitting there, and writing that letter to his son. It's just amazing. And then I imagined my father receiving it.
He didn't receive the letter for 3 years and knew at the time that he was reading his father's final wishes.
And what his father wishes for him, that he will not use his profession of curing, he was a doctor, not just use his profession of curing to gather wealth, but that he used it to be a benefactor to the suffering humanity. And that was the way I met my grandfather. I got the opportunity to meet. And I instantly fell in love with this man when I read the letter.
Inspired by a single letter written by a relative she had never met, Joanie had all 400 letters translated and learned that they were from 78 different writers. When pieced together, they revealed a fascinating, heartbreaking, and ultimately inspiring story with her father as the central character. Oswald Holzer was a young doctor in the Czech army when the Nazis arrived in 1939 and incorporated his unit. In a daring escape, he returned to Prague to see his parents and then made his way to China, one of the few countries accepting those of Jewish heritage. It was there that he met and married Joanie's mother, the daughter of American missionaries. Within months, they were on the President Coolidge evacuation ship carrying Americans from Asia as the Japanese became more aggressive in advance of Pearl Harbor. The letters are a first-hand account of young people fleeing the Nazi Holocaust. Joanie dubbed them adventurers against their will in her award-winning first book. Translating the letters wasn't enough. Joanie traveled to places mentioned in the letters, found and spoke to the few letter writers still alive, and interviewed descendants of those who were gone. In the end, it was a story she had to share.
These are my inspiration. When I started writing, it was all new to me. I always wanted to write, wrote when I was little kind of thing, and I was overwhelmed with the collection, how much there was and what I was going to do and how I was going to write the story and everything. And a friend of mine said one day, knew about the pants and all, said, you should just go upstairs one day and you should just strip down and put on the pants and wear the pants. And that'll give you your inspiration. And I did that.
The letters revealed that her father wore his old riding pants over his military uniform on the day that he made his life-saving escape.
It was better to wear that because there were people walking in riding pants at that time in history. So you could just kind of disappear into a crowd and people didn't notice.
What do they represent? Obviously, his ingenuity, his determination.
They really represent everything. I think mostly they represent the fact that my brother, sister, and I exist.
They're now part of an important historical collection and educational platform that Joanie has built and shares with teachers and students in the U.S. and Europe.
So you have to understand that history. And there are many echoes of today really around the world. So it kind of haunts you a little bit when you see that. And it's really good for kids in school. I mean, you can learn about the Holocaust, but you can also learn about, what happens when autocrats go into control and what that looks like. And again, there's echoes of that around the world.
Before discovering the letters, Joanie had no real details about how her father's journey to America began, but she certainly knew how it ended. He was married and in love with her mother for 60 years, raised a wonderful family, and granted his father's dying wish, becoming a pillar in his community and using his skills as a doctor, not just to make money, but to make a difference.
Despair, it brings darkness into people's lives, but hope really invigorates us and moves us on. And I think that's the way that my father lived his life.
My Dear Boy, written in her father's voice, is as fascinating as it is important, a reminder of the dangers of human aggression and intolerance and the power of love and compassion.
I still believe that, one candle in a room can light it up and it provides hope. And so what I see are a lot of very re-engaged people, and then the new generation really coming forward and speaking up and becoming active.
Sharing her father's story has added an entirely new chapter to her story with the promise of more to come.
It's been great. And I really do feel like it gave me a purpose I never would have been expecting to be given. I'm 70, and that was a number that, sounded daunting a while back, but now I feel great. I mean, I think that, there's a lot to happen. I love seeing the world. I love traveling the world, and I feel very fortunate. So I think women of my age, really look at the world differently than our moms did, and we're lucky for that.
Thank you so much, Joanie, for that video. So it gives us some background on what Joanie did and has been doing. But I just wanted to, I have a few questions for Joanie so we can walk through this journey. And I told her, she can take it anywhere she wants. But I just wanted to say a few things because I know there are some students on here about Czechoslovakia, right? So Czechoslovakia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was also founded in 1918. And there were a population of, at that time, I would say about 400,000 Jews. And unfortunately, 263,000 Jews were exterminated during the Holocaust. But before I say anything about the Holocaust, I want some of the students and also people to understand that anti-Semitism has been there for thousands of years. It was not a new hatred or prejudice against a religious group. But it took a turn in a different way. So from religious persecution of Jews, it became a racial persecution of Jews. So a little bit of context on Czechoslovakia, but also the idea that we don't really know much about. We know about the camps in Eastern Europe, but we really don't know much about the culture and what was going on before that. So through Joanie's book, I learned a little bit about what's going on in Czechoslovakia and about Holocaust history. But also I wanted to learn a little bit about how you even connect, Joanie, to Czechoslovakia at all, if you do.
Well, I connect a lot to it now. When I was growing up, I knew my father really loved his homeland and he talked a lot about it. And then I inherited his past, literally, through these letters and photographs and stories that he told in an interview that I did with him earlier. And all of it came together so I could really understand his passion for his homeland and the feeling of loss that he had. I think sometimes there are things that you see in life that you can't unsee. And one of them is, painful when you think about it. And, a lot of people lost their homes and lives and, families. And today's a day that we really remember that. And I think that the loss that my father suffered, he buried his whole life. I think my brother, Tom, who I saw his name flash up, so I know he's on here with us, and my sister Patty, and I think we grew up in a household where we really didn't see that pain from him a lot, and he didn't talk about it very much. And so I think learning what I've learned through this journey, which has been a long journey now, 12 solid years, uncovering what was the story for him personally, but also I saw and hear the name Poppy Lechner. Her father, John Lechner, is part in a chapter in my first book, and they now live in Australia, in New Zealand. Sorry, in New Zealand, and I saw him about 3 years ago. I know really that search for how you rebuild your life is so important. And the Czech background, and they are a very close society. They hold a lot of family reunions. We've returned now 5 times and gone to 5 family reunions that keep growing and growing. And I think that it's a land that really was wounded over many years, whether it was during the Austro-Hungarian Empire under their control and they wanted their freedom, to the point where they got it and then lost it to the Nazis and then lost it to the communists. So it's a story different than a lot of countries, and they had a very vibrant democracy when the Nazis arrived, and so they lost a lot, and they knew it, and it took a long time for them to get that back.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So tell me a little bit about your journey. So you discover these letters, and you say, okay, I'm just gonna focus on this for the rest of my life, or I'm gonna go to all these archives. I know that this is really hard research and work that you have to do, and looking through documents can be mind-boggling. I just created an archive at Manhattan, and it was just, it's painstaking work.
It is. And when I started, I had no idea. When I started at the beginning, I was thinking I was going to write a family story, mostly based on an interview that I had done with my father in 1989. And it was his stories that he told in that, and it was a lifetime of stories, 7 hours, with about 3 of it that really covered his family background, really interesting stories. And all of it was kind of either cheerful or adventure stories. It didn't really reveal that pain. But so I had that, and I had listened to it, long before I retired and sold my engineering company in 2000. So I was 2008. So, and they had died in 2000, my parents. And so I was just beginning into it. I didn't know what to expect. And then happenstance, I started putting all the letters, I scanned them all, and then I put them in protective covers, and I was kind of getting them organized, and then discovered that last letter of my grandfather's, which ended up being the first letter then that I had translated. And when I read that and I heard his wish, which I saw it almost as a blessing to my father, it was giving him direction on how to live his life that he did, and became a benefactor to suffering humans in his job as a doctor, but well beyond that in what he did. So it changed his life. And so when I read it, I thought, this is really important. This is changing my life, but I think it can change other people's lives, because it really was a voice from that past, and a horrific past, I knew that, that held hope, that was really hopeful. So I kind of went off, and then the first research that I was doing, I finally decided I really needed to go to the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And so I did that in November of 2008. And when I look back on that, it was really a watershed moment for me. Not only has part of this journey been wonderful because I've met so many people along the way, particularly that are involved in the Holocaust history or in archives and all over the world, that really want to help you and really care. And one, Micheline Amir, goes by Mickey, became a lifelong friend now. She was in the archives in the reference library, and she introduced me to Peter Black, who was then the senior historian, and Henry Mayer, who was the archives director. And from that, they really saw that it was a substantial personal collection and that they could help me. And so, you know, I think really it's been a journey of discovery for me on how this all works. And then, of course, you know, the internet and what you can do there. And so I'm able to visit, so to speak, Yad Vashem without going there yet. And they were helpful, and other archives all over the place. So, and then I began to meet the people that were attached to the letters. A couple that I went to see that were still alive, that one that was a very good friend of my father's, who is actually the, would have been the uncle to Poppy Lechner's father. I went and I saw a man that was in Chicago that had gone, that was a young man, younger than my father, but that went to China at the same time as my father, but they were in different places and they wrote each other, and he was related through marriage to my father. And so I started really being drawn to these people and knowing that I had to know about them. So beyond doing genealogy like you would for your own family, I started doing almost that for other families and learning more about what their lives were like. So it's been archiving and genealogy and searching and putting all the web together to come up with a story that people can relate to, I hope.
Yeah, and you know, I want to say, I mean, it's a little secret, although, you know, I'm a professor, but also director, that when I sat on the floor recently in the archive and I was looking through boxes, I found this passport I had never seen before. And I said to myself, I think this is my happy place. You know, like it was just like this stuff was happening, right? So, I mean, I think I resonate with that. But, you know, let's stay with the letters, because I think the letters are telling, very important. I know that you have to have them translated. And that must have been kind of, you must be really impatient about that. But also, you mentioned, you know, your father escaping through Shanghai. Could you share a little bit about that and maybe a couple of letters that would kind of tell the story to the students, especially that are here?
Okay. So Shanghai, if you're a scholar, a lot of people know about it. But mostly when I mention where my father went, most people do not know Shanghai's history at that point, and it was unique. And probably some 20,000 Jews from Europe survived because of what the situation was there. My father, I will tell you, when he escaped from, you saw his riding pants and that he escaped. When he escaped from, he was in his army unit. It was then taken over by the Nazis. He managed to escape and he went back to Prague. And he quickly realized it was obvious what was going to go on in Prague, and with some brutality to the Jews there. So he knew he was in danger. He was trying to talk his parents into leaving, who chose, as a lot of people did, to stay behind, thinking it would just get better later. And so my father worked on getting his paperwork that at that moment, so he escaped in the latter part of March 1939, he made it back, and he ends up leaving in May. So from the time he gets to Prague, he's working on paperwork to satisfy the Nazis at that moment. Everything was changing. It was a turmoil and you didn't really know what you needed, but he managed to get a letter that said he was going to go to work. He had worked as a intern in med school when he was going to school at Batya Shoe Company, which was a huge shoe producing company from the Czech lands, and they had offices all over the world. And one was in Singapore. And my father had worked one summer as an intern for them. And so he went to them and they wrote a letter that said that they were sending him to their Singapore office. So that gave him a little bit. He went in search of the visa requirement, and he ended up buying a black market visa to China. And there was a group of people in Great Britain that were very dissatisfied with Chamberlain's appeasement to Hitler, that had established a fund. So although they were freezing everybody's business, their bank accounts, and he wouldn't have money to go, he was able to get money from that fund that would be available to buy his ticket. So he bought a ticket that was leaving from Marseille, France, and he went to China. And what was happening in China was the Japanese had invaded once again, as they had many times, in China, and that war had started in 1937. And by then, by the time he was coming, they controlled the port of Shanghai. They didn't control all of Shanghai, but they controlled the port, and they did not require visas or a landing permit, which later became very expensive for people to have landing permits. So it was kind of a happenstance. It was just for a little while, and he was very lucky. It didn't last long, but while he was there, he arrived probably at the peak of the wave starting in, and so he was in July of 1939 arriving. So his experience was a little bit different than a lot of the Jews that came there who were penniless, and there were some people that had helped set up an area where they could go. And so they were in a ghetto situation. With my father, he had a distant relative that was an import-exporter who actually found a place that my father could be in what was called the French section, which was, there were designated international areas for trade in Shanghai, and he was in the French area. So his story is a little bit different, and he's there only for 6 months. And then I've been told by my Chinese expert that reviews everything I do, it was very unique what my father did. He decided he wanted to leave and go somewhere and practice medicine. It was very hard there were so many doctors that poured into Shanghai, you couldn't get enough patients, and you didn't talk Chinese and everything. So he ended up getting a job at an American Brethren hospital in Shanxi province, way in the interior, and went there to relieve a doctor that was going on leave there. And they sent him to Beijing. It was called Peking at the time. They sent him to the language school, and he was able to have immersive training where within 4 months he spoke pretty good Chinese, and that made a world of difference for him too. And later, incidentally, when he met my mother, when he came to, he went back to the hospital, the American Brethren hospital in the interior, and he actually came there to buy supplies for the hospital, and the communists were fighting the Japanese in that area, and the Japanese blew up the railroad track, so he was trapped in Peking, and it was fate, because he would just a few days later meet my mother and instantly fall in love with her. And the language that they spoke to each other, because my father spoke hardly any English, was Chinese, because my mother, was born there and spoke Chinese. So anyway, their union was probably what really changed the course of my father's life. I think in many, many ways, all good. But that's kind of the story of Shanghai for my family.
So, tell me some of these letters. Why did your father have these letters?
Well, I wish I could ask him, how he decided to save what he saved, because I think there are some that are missing that I wish I had, but he ended up saving 400 letters, and they were multi-page. And then he took a lot of photographs. He was a great photographer. He took film. I have vintage film from that era, some of it pretty amazing around China. And of course, he wrote journals too. So I had, between the interview I did with him, the 7 hours of interviews, and all of that he did save, I had really the ability to know what he was thinking, because he saved 70 carbon copies of his own letters. And I think he kept a lot of them because they were family and close friends, and I don't think you'd just throw them away. And the ones that he wrote, I think he may have kept the carbon copies, because he was writing long, beautiful letters about what was happening to him. And he was writing multiple people's stories. And so I think he may have been trying to keep track who he told what, is sort of what I think. And thank goodness he did it, because they really are incredible historic letters. Yeah, I pulled out, I thought you would ask me about the letters. And so I pulled out a few.
Yes, I was just going to say, could you read us a couple? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. This one is May 18th, 1940. It's from Karel Schoenbaum, and he's in London, and he escaped. He was a lawyer and a good friend of my father's, even from childhood. Their fathers knew each other. And he was a lawyer that escaped to London, and he was at Oxford, actually. And I'm just going to read, this is actually from my father to Karel. And he's writing what I call kind of a testament of a letter of how he feels. My dad says, I think you did not correctly understand my decision to stay abroad, or better said, my reasons for it. It is not for the love or liking of the Far East. You can believe me that I feel at home in Bohemia. But lately, especially lately, I have been thinking much about all that I have lived through, and then I came to the realization that I was always considered a citizen of a second degree, that I never had full rights in my homeland, and that really everywhere it was implied to me I was only being tolerated. Do you think all of this will change? Do you really think that this present equality of sorts will last even after an eventual return to our homeland? Do you think that the various elements set against each other will again be able to unite towards some positive work? You know, in these matters, I am a great pessimist. This is the main reason why I don't want to return then. This so-called Czech feeling of mine was hurt too strongly. I never felt this, but now I see it. I think it is a tragedy of all of us assimilated ones of the second and third generation. Possibly it is a mistake to try to adjust again in yet another country, but I am determined not to return. Maybe you discuss this issue in your club in London, and I would surely be more interested in your opinion about our future in the eventual Third Republic. This is where I am turning to you for your help, and I beg you to write me according to the best knowledge and conscience. So to me, this was one of the letters that I really, really was taken with my father, and it really haunts me. It haunts me to this day because he's really talking about what was a nation that was a great democracy, and under the president, Thomas Masaryk, he had put a lot of emphasis into assimilation of the peoples. And there were many different groups, actually, that the Czechoslovakia combined. So it wasn't just the Jews, but this is really about the Jews, where they felt like they had assimilated in a country like that. And then really my father's pouring his heart out how he didn't feel that way, that it didn't work. So that was one. Another one is a letter that was written by a, he called her his aunt. She was a first cousin of his mother, and she is writing from the US. She came to the US in early 1940. She managed to get here, and she's in Camden, Maine when she's writing. And she had come from a wealthy family, and she, you know, I'm guessing she was probably in her 50s maybe when she wrote this. She says, Erna is her sister. Erna forwarded me your letter. I can easily imagine how you feel, and I would be really happy if you could get here as soon as possible. Not that the conditions here are much better. There are huge unemployment problems and strong anti-Semitic feelings. You can read daily ads in the newspapers as "will hire Aryan." Signs on some houses read, "will rent a flat to Aryans only." I am not afraid of anything, and I am curiously waiting for how it all ends. I don't see a very bright future. She goes on with a lot of other circumstances that really tell you in America what we since have studied and learned, that there was a lot of anti-Semitism, and clearly it weighed in on a lot of levels. But her letter was really interesting to me in that regard, reading that. And then this one is kind of, I'll read you a part of it. It's a letter from actually Karl Schoenberg's brother named Franta. And this is December 1st, 1945. So this is after the war ended. And he says, "Dear Vlada, thanks for your letter. I see that I wasn't mistaken when I used to call you Mr. Professor. All in all, we haven't seen each other for 6 years, but to me, it seems 60. My congratulations to your son. I cannot even imagine you as a father of a family. Remember how we used to chase our highly esteemed professors into a ditch with that ancient vehicle of yours, or some other jokes here. I can hardly believe today that I ever laughed. I certainly don't mean to dwell on tragedy that I am already dumped on those who were in correspondence with me immediately after the war. But somehow we unlearned humor, and we also got older. It wasn't pretty. I think it is best depicted by this joke. 3 Hebrews met in 1938, and one says he is going to Brazil. The other is going to Canada. The third says he's staying home. The other 2 nod their heads and say, yes, you were always such an adventurer. In short, the whole thing was a son of a bitch. And if someone is still alive, he can damn well rejoice, because it is nothing but a coincidence. It was indeed a devilish system, but unfortunately it cannot be said that people will learn. If we watch the Nuremberg trials from the point of view of the German Lebensraum, which was living space when they took over the lands, inhabitants, we have reason to be pessimistic about the future. Most people lack the gift of imagination, and what they don't go through seems nothing but propaganda to them. And that really haunted me, thinking about, he was already saying what really became true. And a lot of the letters are very interesting in terms of that they do forecast the future. And none of them could see what was going to happen with the Holocaust, really, or what would happen with their own country, whether they would get their country back. They called it the Third Republic because it would have been at that point. But they, some of them really had really good predictions of what was happening. And my father's predictions about China in some of his letters are really amazing. He really saw the emergence of a later China that would trade with everybody in the world. And he talks about it. And, I sat there and thought, this is pretty amazing.
Wow. Thank you, Joanie. I would love to hear, I've read some of them, but I love the fact that you could explain what each letter is. And so I just have a couple more questions. I'm going to ask you to put your questions in chat, or you can even unmute yourself when we're ready for questions for Joanie. So you can choose either way that you prefer. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this. Can you tell us the story of Reinhard Heydrich? Because he is the butcher of Prague. He was the person that really basically came up with the Jewish solution. In Wannsee, he is somebody that, I have my students study when I do the Holocaust and talk about, the different architects of really what the Jewish solution was supposed to be. And you have this really incredibly interesting story about him. Could you share that with us?
Yes, it's interesting because when I started out, I really didn't know who he was. And a lot of people know the Hitler and Adolf Eichmann and Goering and Himmler, but I've learned that a lot of people don't know who Reinhard Heydrich was. And a lot of experts think he may have been the first who would have replaced Hitler if something had happened. And he was very powerful in the security issue, and he was ruthless. So one of the things that came out of the Wannsee meeting was the decision that they couldn't just incarcerate all the Jews, the 11 million that they said were in that whole area that they controlled, but they needed to have a solution, basically the final solution. So they created the idea, and he led this, which was to build 3 extermination camps: Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor. And so when I first started doing my research, and Peter Black, the chief historian, had some research done for me, and my father, who in 1993, when Schindler's List came out, and I asked him if he wanted to go to the movie with me, which I realize now was crazy, having seen the movie and all. And he said no. He sat down, and while I was watching, he typed a list of 44 relatives who had died in the Holocaust. And until then, my brother and sister and I had only thought that our grandparents and our great-grandmother had died. And that was the first time we really knew the extent of it, 44 people. And my father listed all the places that he thought that they were killed, and most of them were killed at Auschwitz. But Peter Black told me, when he did the research on my grandparents, they were taken away fairly early in April of 1942, and they were taken to Theresienstadt in German, that's in the Czech lands. And that was, and then a month later, they were transported to the east, to Lublin is the last record in Poland where they were, where Majdanek was under construction at the time. But Peter said that there was a train that then left and took a large number of Bohemian Jews on to Sobibor. It's very early in the history of Sobibor, which was the extermination camp. And so that was the first time I'd ever heard of Sobibor. And my grandparents went there. So then later for Heydrich, his demise was that in 1942, the British had been planning what ended up being called Project Anthropoid, and it was about how to assassinate Heydrich. And they actually helicoptered from a plane, parachuted 2 people in who attempted the assassination, first with shooting him. He was in an open car driving through Prague, and then the gun failed, but then he ended up throwing another one through a bomb into the car, and he was still alive. He made it to Bolvica Hospital, and there he died 4 days later. But that day was May 27th. So it was one of the first things that I realized that happened together, that my grandparents probably died on May 27th, and the attempt on his life was May 27th. And I knew that. And then when we went there, my husband Roger and I went, and my cousin Tomas Maciek took us all over all the places that were mentioned in the letters, or that were in the interviews and everything, so I could research and see all these storytelling places. And we went to 4 concentration camps on that trip: the Terezin, Majdanek, Sobibor, and Auschwitz. And when we went to Sobibor, the U.S. Holocaust Museum had arranged an expert, and when we got there, and he showed it to us, and it's a very haunting place. And I asked him how long they would have been there. He said they would have been here about 2 hours, is the length of time before they were either shot or gassed at Sobibor. And so I began to really realize that Reinhard Heydrich kind of had imprinted my family history. And then it grew a little bit more in that the day that we went there, actually, our family reunion had been changed. The date had been changed, and we didn't even realize we were going to be there on that same day. And that was really kind of a threshold moment of realizing that. There was also my father's escape pants. On them are little check buttons, and it took me a long time. I was actually writing about them for the book, and I went over to them. They hung near mine, and I looked at it all just kind of to be able to describe them. And I realized these little words were on there. And one said Ferd, F-E-R-D, Chara, Pardubice, which is a town in the Czech lands. And the other one was especially made by. So I figured it was the pants were made by the Czech army, but I didn't know what Ferd, Chara, and Pardubice meant. And I looked it up on the internet, and there was a school there. So I wrote the school in English, not knowing if anybody would respond. And a few days later, a woman responded that the buttons weren't made there, but that there was a tailor named Ferdinand Chara, and he had been involved in the underground that assassinated Reinhard Heydrich, and he was shot himself by the Germans. So the pants that my father had made, had a direct link really to Reinhard Heydrich and the man that really tried to help his demise. And then lastly, in the interview that I did with my father, there was a story that I knew that I had heard the Heydrich name before, and this was back in 1989. And it finally, somewhere along the way, I thought, I'm going to look, and good news for Word documents that you've typed, that you can find something really quickly. And so up popped my father's story about Heydrich. And the story was that Vlada, he had a really good friend, childhood friend, and then in college and everything, named Vladivore Wagner, who became, at the same time he was in med school with my dad, he became a hematologist. He was not Jewish. He stayed during the war, and he got a job at Bolvica, the big hospital in Prague. And the day that it happened, that they tried to kill Heydrich, they brought him to that hospital. And Vlada, who ended up being, somebody that was well known in the hematology business and was on boards all over the world later in his life and everything, he had told my father that they had switched the type of blood on him when he was in there. And there was a lot, there's a lot said about the security, that you couldn't get to him and everything. But at the very beginning, there was a Czech doctor that was involved in something they were doing when they were trying to keep him alive. and people could have had access. So whether that was true or not, I didn't know, but one of my translators said that's a bomb in history if that turns out, because nobody's, knew that the Czechs were involved. And I wondered why, Vlada would tell my father that, but why it wouldn't be known. And then as I got into the history of what happened, and right after Reinhard Heydrich died, Hitler and his crew unleashed unmercifully on the Czech people. And they slaughtered a lot of people in one town and sent a lot of people to concentration camps, anybody they could think that might have been involved in it. So it was a very difficult thing that a lot of Czechs, even to this day, don't really think that it was worth what happened in the Czech lands. So, but I think, I don't know if Leo Greenbaum is on, but I think he was going to try and get on. He was doing some research for me one time, and he read in German the autopsy that was about Reinhard Heydrich in German, that's in the Evo archives, and it's undiscernible. I've talked to a lot of experts. There's no way to know if that story is true. But what I thought, Vladivore Wagner wrote papers later about things they did that were like that, where the Czechs were supposed to be sending blood to the war lines where they were in the field when they were injured, and they figured out a way to make the blood look like it was an A blood or B blood or whatever. And then by the time they would give it to them, it could change after that, and it would be dangerous. And so I know there was something going on just from the papers that he wrote that people had. And what I think is that he just wouldn't have said it out loud because it wasn't something that people would have been so happy with, frankly, because a lot of people were, not happy with even the thing happening at all, that so many people lost their lives. So anyway, all this time, Reinhard Heydrich just kept coming back into my life, and I really read a lot about him, read a couple books about him, and he really was, a horrific guy. And I don't know if he can be worse than Hitler, but he might have been.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Joanie. I mean, I had a last question, but we're already running out of time. But if you have any questions, I think there's Ireland. Is there any questions in the chat?
I have one question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, let's get to the chat first, and then we'll go to Mohammed.
Yeah, the only question we've had submitted so far is if you could explain what your background says.
What my what?
Your background.
My background. Yes, the background photo. It's actually of the Pincus Synagogue, from the Pincus Synagogue in Prague. And in 1995, when my husband and Derek went with us, and Kelly, my daughter, was unable to go because she had to work, but we went to Prague, and it was the only time that I was really there with my father. And it is the place, Pincus is the place, excuse me, where 80,000 names from the Jews that were taken from Prague are memorialized. So it's the way we remember. If we remember them, they live. And my grandparents' names are up there along with a lot of other relatives.
Mohammed, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, Joanie, your father's life story is so inspiring. It's wonderful. It's a demonstration of the triumph of hope and love over hate. Mm. And he spent his life, throughout his life, in doing humanitarian work. And I found that so inspiring. But I also found your mother's story so inspiring with her background. Would you please tell us something about her?
Yes. My mother, of course, she was born in China of American missionaries, and my grandfather was there for 20 years, actually. And she was a very, very special person, because my mom really, I believe, epitomized the golden rule. That was what she taught us. My brother's on here. I know he could speak to it too. She was an extraordinarily loving person and very open. I mean, for her, it was, if you led a good life and you try to help others, then you succeeded. And that's the way she lived. And she was very involved in the community. She was like one of those that was president of the PTA and of the hospital guild. And she was a teacher by trade, but she gave a lot of talks in town about background and their history and everything. So a lot of people knew my mom and loved her. So I'm very fortunate. I had two great parents, and You know, I think they raised us with a lot of love, and as much as the pain now that I realize my father went through, I mean, he shielded us from that. And, you know, that's a gift that you can give somebody, but it also makes me sad that we were never able to really talk to him about the very hard stuff.
Any questions from the audience? I mean, yes, Danielle?
Hi. I'm wondering if you can just to try to give us a flavor of your dad's background, your dad's growing up in Czech. If you could relate just a brief story, a vignette that he passed on to you about, you know, these adventure stories or I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, some of the stories of childhood, you know, are just good stories of things that happened to him in his hometown in Benishov with family and everything. But I think his adventure stories really come when he's in China. And, you know, I mean, it was everything from riding on the train he had two little dogs that were in a basket that he had on top of the you know, in the train car. And a Japanese soldier came in armed, you know, into it, and they looked at each other, and, you know, then they went on reading and everything. And my father had put them across from him instead of right over him. And all of a sudden, the Japanese soldier is wiping his head. There's some water coming down, he thinks. And then right when they arrive at a stop, the soldier gets up to leave, and my dad grabs the basket and the dogs bark, and the soldier looks at him and brings his gun up, and then he decides it's not worth it, and he just walks off. So, I mean, these are silly stories, but that, you know, my father just had a million of them. He was a great storyteller. I think from the Czech side of it there's a story when my father graduated from med school. There's a theater in Prague, a beautiful golden theater, and I can't think of the name of it, but so he and his buddies in college age graduates and everything go there, and the lights are dimming and the movie's going to come on, and all of a sudden the lights come back on, and the ticket seller says, Dr. Holzer, is there Dr. Holzer here? We have a call for you. He's walking down the aisle saying this, and so my father gets up and he starts walking, and then all of a sudden everybody starts clapping, because that was how they learned that he had graduated from med school. He had earned his doctorate degree. And it's such a funny story. He had told that story. And then when we went to a family reunion, one of the younger cousins said, "Oh, I have a great story to tell." And he told that story. So it was just a silly way to get everybody to know he graduated. But I don't know. That's probably not giving you the best of the stories, but off the top of my head.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? Any students want to ask a question?
I can tell you a story that's amazing. There's a lot of, I call them synchronicities, and they're things that have happened along the way, a lot of things that are just totally unexplainable. And one of them I like to tell is about one of the people I write about in my first book, Adventures Against Their Will, was a first cousin of my father, Hannah Winternitz. I probably mentioned her, I think. Anyways, she used to write letters that included the name Eva I'll say her name wrong, Pavalska. And it was her good friend from childhood. And they had gone through all kinds of things when they were little and everything. And then she added it to a journal. Her daughter had sent me things from Great Britain to look at. And she talked a lot about her. And so right when I was ending the book and I was about to say this, you know, the manuscript's totally finished, I don't know why, I kept thinking about Eva and wondered what happened to her. And I knew her daughter had sent me, Hannah's daughter had sent me copies of pages out of her address book. And it was people that had come to America. And in there was an Eva Gould. And she was in LA. And I had thought for some reason that she was in California, or she had ended up in California. And so I went online and pulled up and put in Eva Gould, her whole name, and up came this house that was for sale. And it was for sale for like $6 million. And it had one of these realtor things. You can walk through the house and everything. And so then I thought, wow, it didn't say anything more. You know how names, little lines come up on your Google thing, but that was all that was there. And I was really busy. And so I said, oh, I'm just going to write her a letter, send her copies of some of Hannah's letters and her relationship and all. And so I did, and I put it in the mail. And a week later, I get an email from Don Gould, and it's Don Gould, the son of Eva. And he said that his mother had passed away, and that 6 years before they had sold their house to a family that had subsequently become friends of his. And they were now moving to Oregon. And he went over there to say goodbye to them. And while he was there, the postman arrived with my letter. I think that's pretty weird. And then there was another one I can tell you that's about, Poppy, you'll relate to this. I went to Prague, and in the American embassy, I was speaking. And so I was in the room where we were going to put the presentation on. I was going to do a PowerPoint. And it was just me and the technician getting it all ready. And this woman walks in, and she has kind of books in her arms, and she walks and she looks, and then she goes away, and then she comes back and she looks. And the screen on our PowerPoint was frozen on Franz Schoenbaum. And so then that night she came to the presentation, and afterwards she came up to me, and she had never been to the American embassy before. She was picking up some papers for somebody. She looked in, and Franta was her father's best friend later in life. And she ended up she knew so much about Franta. And I had made contact with John Lechner, Poppy's dad, in New Zealand, and even got to meet him, and had really grown to really like him. And he had a history of his own. If you read my book, you'll see it's a very painful story from what happened to his parents, who had split up. And so he became rather estranged from his father later in life. John did. And so this woman actually knew so much about him, and ended up, I think, connecting with John and telling the things she knew. She knew where his ashes had been spread later in life when he died. And she had ridden on the back of his motorcycle. It was all this stuff, but that was just pure happenstance that happened at that very moment. So I can go on. I have about 20 of those that are just like, wow, how did that happen?
Thank you, Joanie, so much. So I just to close it up, first of all, let's give Joanie a hand, everybody, and thank you so much.
Thank you
for being here for us and the students. And if there's one message you want to leave them with, what would you like to say?
Well, I would tell them that the world that you want is in your hands, and you can make it whatever you want. And I think the lessons that we learned from the past give us that chance to really know we don't want to repeat this, and we need to work harder. And you have a chance now to use your voice, to vote, to be vocal, to protect the democracy we have here, and to work for that all over the world if you can. Because really, if you look to the history of Germany and you see the degradation of what happened with democracy, that's the real danger of, and a lot of how this starts. So we're living it right now, and you can learn a lot in school, but you can also take action of your own and feel responsible. And I think that's what we would all hope you do. And I hope you do a better job than we have, because we're leaving you kind of a mess.
Thank you so much, Joanie. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. We really appreciate you being here. Please look out for our programs, and we will be back in the fall, because this is our last event this year. So we are on event 10, Ireland, right? So we do about 10 events, and then we do a lot of community work together as well. But right now, because of COVID, it's been really hard to get my students out there. But the students that are on this call are doing a project with the Friendly Fridge in the Bronx, and they are doing food insecurity awareness. So that's kind of really cool that they're doing that. So you'll see, like, if you want to see it, they'll have a TikTok and an Instagram about it, and a lot of posters educating people about really the horrible food insecurity that we have in this country today.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you
so
for
much.
the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Joanie. Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Bye,
Good
everybody.
night, everybody.